just will give a little background about how I came to this project. So I got a call from some producers in LA. One of them had gone to the same high school as me. You know, it was just a kind of cold solicitation, and I took the call and immediately we clicked. They were like, we have this story, there's a constitutional amendment, it's been around for 100 years, still not ratified, and we need a director, can you be in Virginia in a week? And I was like, sure. I mean, it sounded like a really exciting story, a constitutional amendment. It sounded like a way to come at the issue of social change differently than I had with my previous film, which was about grassroots activism and protest. And so a week later, I was in Virginia. So all of the interviews that you saw had already been shot as part of their development process, and all of the verite footage that you saw was what I went there and shot. And so I'm in a certain way thankful that it didn't get ratified this year, because it gives me the opportunity to actually step back and do the research and digest the situation and, you know, take a different approach. So I don't want to actually give you guys too much about what my approach is. This is obviously not a complete work, so least useful are kind of like, you should include this or that. I'm sure there's a wealth of knowledge in this room, and so I will welcome everyone to email me if there are things, people, facts that you think that you should bring to my attention. But most helpful today are going to be things that are most visceral to you, the things that are really on your mind and your heart, that feel like they're touching your life in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, great. So we're going to throw to you. Like, does anyone have an immediate response?
Well, my first question is actually, can anyone give me like a synopsis of what is going on? Like, what did you actually factually take away from what you just saw?
Yeah.
So when I watched it, I mean, I didn't know a lot of what was the backstory, so it felt like an education at the start, and then at the end, it feels like a call to action. That was kind of how I interpreted it.
Women's rights are still not happening. We're in the same place we were 100 years ago. Like, it's, I mean, not exactly, of course, but we're leaps and bounds away from equality still, and that's just, it's insane. But yeah, we're still fighting.
When you say a work in progress, is it like, is this going to be much, much longer? Are you planning for it to be a lot longer? Is this going to be like a series, or?
Yeah, so right now I'm anticipating this will be a feature film.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Just in terms of what I took away from the clip you saw, or that we saw, I guess I see it as a story about two parallel lines, one about the exclusion of Black women and women of color from the suffragette movement starting in the early 1900s, and then paralleling that with the current sort of new form of feminism that's trying to bring in, or that's being led by Black women to get the right past. So that was sort of my takeaway.
Yes, awesome.
Sorry, like I felt like the introduction of this idea that it's about money, and so is really interesting, because a lot of these opposition things against the ERA are led by emotions, and you know, a lot of the wedge issues that people use try to distract, and I feel like getting to the core of that as quickly as possible, going, this is actually just emotionalized to keep a workforce from getting, you know, to keeping like a poor working class in the South, you know, like or keeping women in domestic situations, you know, so you don't have to pay for like the economy of it, and what that means as like American citizens is like this remnants of people who think there's actually only one group that should be American citizens and benefit from the laws that it means to be protected under the US, and I felt like that was really well laid out and really like exciting to see the less emotional side of it. The only part that I thought wasn't addressing that is when the woman said, what is the like, how is this going to be a crux? The Republican woman is like, is this going to be a crux to hurt us? Mm-hmm. And then you cut to the woman kind of rolling her eyes at the woman. It's a very funny moment, but I also kind of wanted to see that answer. I wanted to like see what that answer to that question was.
Thanks, yeah. Yeah?
I feel like one of the most striking things about this difference between when you go back to Sojourner Truth and these early feminist movements in America, and now there are huge differences. The thing that's the same is that all the progress has been made when women work together of all different socioeconomic backgrounds, of all different races. When we work together, all the progress gets made. And so you have this last question. It does come down to economy, but the ERA is not a new bill. So it's like that last thing. We've made tons of progress, but it's that last thing that we've been saying since the beginning, the all-encompassing equal rights, not just our reproductive rights and not our racial rights, it's just everything. So I think that it's that question of those other women who are not advocating for themselves. How do we get them to hear our message and be pulled into this? Because you don't want to fight with them. You want to pull them in. And I think that's kind of the most striking thing about it, is that we're in this place where we're like, how do you not know that this is for you?
Right, right. Yeah, that's a really good point, and that's one of the places that I really want to take the project, is to look at why is it so hard to pass something that's so simple. And this movement has really been characterized by a legacy of sort of inter-movement betrayal. So first, actually, I want to backpedal because I meant to acknowledge this at the beginning, but we're actually on Iroquois territory. And there's been this inability on behalf of women to sort of acknowledge one another and the fact that we have different experiences of womanhood and different types of oppression. And without necessarily needing to create a hierarchy, we have to, acknowledge the fact that the impacts are not proportionate, and sort of the closer we are to white male power, the less this material impact of this oppression we feel it. So one of the interesting things is that during the abolition movement, white women were a really large part of the effort to abolish slavery. But what we often forget is that the abolition of slavery really gave citizenship to black men. Yeah. Now, those citizenship rights were not respected, and it took the civil rights movement to actually get those enforced. But during the time between abolition and civil rights, black men had the right to vote, and all of the arguments for black sort of liberation and citizenship were around black men. So it was this sort of diversification of the patriarchy that was going on. And there was a sort of quid pro quo agreement and a famous schism between Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, where basically the agreement was, okay, we'll get slavery abolished and then you'll help us get suffrage for women, and it was supposed to be universal suffrage. And once slavery was abolished, black men were sort of like, no, we'll aspire to this manhood where we can own our women. And it kind of like, this is the birth of this kind of like aspiration on behalf of black folks to this family structure that we've really never had access to. So there's a lot of complexity within that, and I want to hear you guys sort of respond to that. But I'll also point to one more piece of history, which was mentioned in the piece in 1913. Black women were asked to march in the back and were really discouraged from being visible participants in the suffrage movement, because there was this fear that, your maid is going to be voting with you, and there was this fear that you were going to have this huge voting bloc that was going to be able to vote against the interests of white men. And I think we see that carrying over even now until today, like who's being disenfranchised and why. So I just wanted to offer that into the space and then get some reactions from folks.
So we've kind of explored some of the past and the kind of context that you're basing the film in, but it'd be really great to kind of understand a little bit more about how you in the present you see this moving forward, and also what additional contributions you're looking for from the room in respects to who's not in that conversation, who's been left out, but also, I guess, present discussions around intersectionality, especially because language and participation has seemed to have changed in a mainstream way so much at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. So right now the situation is that in November they need to swing at least one House seat in Virginia. Really one seems like it would be enough, but they're pushing for as many as they can. So November 5th is that election. And that's obviously a really important election for this bill, but just generally across the board in Virginia, a huge election. And so they're fighting on the ground to get that done. And it's really interesting to watch, and it was actually challenging for me personally to go into this environment and see these women who, had the time, the space, and the resources to be dedicating themselves to this. And it wasn't like the activists in Ferguson who, were homeless when they were doing these things. They, it was a relatively resourced movement. And I had to personally grapple with the question, well, why this? When maternal mortality is so disproportionately high for Black women, when women are being blocked from getting abortions all across the country, when there are so many immediate issues facing women, why the ERA? And it really took me kind of spending some time thinking about Katie, who's one of the main women that you see, and like, why would she choose to do this? And it strikes me that she grew up in North Dakota. She's a fourth generation Republican. Her tactic is to be very demure and very polite and not ruffle any feathers. But she's really trying to set a different example for her daughters. She has two daughters. One is gender nonconforming. And she doesn't want them to live the same kind of life that she's lived, which has been materially very comfortable, but very much under the thumb of her husband, before that, her father. And, and I've been privy to, very intimate conversations with her and realizing that, wow, like, although there may not be this material struggle in the same way, I can completely connect with the idea of not wanting your child to have their destiny shaped by, what a man wants. And so it was really a challenge for me, honestly, to connect with that struggle because I grew up around poor folks who don't really have the luxury to fight for ideological battles. And so I kind of want to open up to the room with all that's going on in our country and our world. What are the things that are most pressing to you? What are the conversations that you're having in your communities or that you wish you were having, or a conversation that you want to see had that a film can kind of spark and open up when it comes to class and when it comes to these issues of gender? I have a lot of rage toward America. My family goes back generations. My great-great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. And I feel like this is my country and it has never served me and has never lived up to any of its promises, and I'm very angry. And so to be able to explore the Constitution and the ways in which it has failed and the levers of power that has allowed it to, I don't even want to say fail, that has allowed it to effectively operate to the benefit of very few, I really cherish that opportunity because I think when a coherent argument can be made about that, that's how we move things forward. And while I don't necessarily know if we even have the right raw materials to work with, I know that a more educated populace is definitely what's necessary. So that's my mission and my purpose. And particularly to expose greed, because underneath all of this are people who are fearful and greedy and trying to secure as much for themselves at the exclusion of others. And it's really fundamentally illogical. It's not logical to not provide women with equal pay. It doesn't help our economy, it doesn't help our children, it doesn't help the future of our country. And so the opportunity to expose those fallacies and get up close to them is what really excites me about the project. One of the most challenging things to show on film is intellectual dishonesty. So you have the one person who's keeping this in the committee that's not going to vote it out. His name is Kirk Cox, of all things. And you can't make this up. And he's very quiet, he's very polite. He'll never say something that's going to be, he's not the one that's going to have a scandal. But he's very intentional and very intellectually dishonest. So when the politicians are speaking to their bases about abortions, they know that this is a financial issue. They know what they're doing, but their populations are not educated in the same way. And the crux of it is religion. The crux of it is the idea of a God-given way of life. So when you start to unravel the issue of gender equality, especially when you look at it through an intersectional lens, it's like pulling a thread that really unravels the whole entire fabric. And so I'm grateful to you for pointing that out, and it is something that I'm very intentionally trying to work with, but it's like, how do you show intellectual dishonesty on behalf of the people who are feeding people misinformation, look at people's religious views with a certain respect to people's right to have their spirituality, and also look at the way that it's being used detrimentally, and stay focused on the stories of women. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but thank you.
As we're moving into the sort of last 10 minutes or so, when you're talking about the exclusion, I mean, a lot of the film focuses on those who've been excluded and people coming together now. Going forward and in this moment, is there a desire on the parts of, Black women and other, POC groups to be a part of a movement which has, for so long, not spoken in their voice? And then, I think maybe this is too much of a question that people always ask filmmakers, which is, how can we solve that? So I don't want to do that. But at least for the purposes of this film, how do you show actually that there is a potential that people don't want to be part of this movement, which understandably, or at least theoretically, will benefit us or you all as American women?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, my tactic is always to try to come at things from the side. I think that getting involved in the same dialogue, a lot of times it's just stale and it's impossible. So what I want to do is actually reframe the idea of inclusion. I don't like the idea of inclusion. Black women have been feminists from the very minute that we stepped on these shores, so we don't need to be brought into white feminism. And in the same way that white women cannot necessarily be brought into, you're not going to necessarily go join the deltas, and we have different fights that we have to fight. We have different fronts that we have to battle on. We have different terms of engagement. And so I think what it needs to be about is the building of a coalition that has mutual respect and understanding and acknowledgement of each other's different histories, of the fact that we have all, and I will say that white women have also been fighting from the very beginning, have been considered property, have been used as breeders, have been treated very unjustly. And that's a different kind of, indigenous women called white women the women who die in childbirth, because of the way that they were a part of a white man's property and legacy. And this whole thing has been designed for white male kind of legacy building and property building. And so understanding the ways in which we have all suffered, understanding the ways in which we have all maybe been complicit in the suffering of others, and understanding the ways in which we all bring strength to the table that can help us if we can resist the temptation to sort of throw each other under the bus, which is what tends to happen over and over, and which is why we're 51% of the population, but can't seem to wield that politically. So that's my approach. A short answer to the question of what are the stakes. So there are 3 levels of scrutiny to constitutional amendments: strict, intermediate, and basic. And so this would make claims of gender discrimination would be processed under strict scrutiny in the Supreme Court, which means that you would have to have a really, really, really dramatic justification for why you need to discriminate based on gender, which is currently the case for race, religion, and country of origin, and not for gender. So it would be a really much more powerful legal tool to support women who bring claims of gender discrimination to the Supreme Court. Right now, if you bring a claim, you're very likely to lose. It's a very good point about what the Supreme Court looks like today. It's not going to be like we passed this and now overnight wage discrimination is illegal. Someone will have to bring a case to court and win. So there's definitely a lot more. And I think to your question about who is this for, I actually think from a place of where am I making this from? I've been hired to direct. My producer's job is to find the audience for this film and make sure that it meets them. I'm making this from a place of we're not at the point of saying what's next because we don't even know where we are. We don't even know what we've been through. This history that we've lived through, that various groups of women have lived through, has not been surfaced, it has not been talked about, it has not been canonized, and it has not been brought into one place. And so what really excites me is elevating female heroes, canonizing them, elevating our struggles, and looking at the places that we've been victorious and the places that we've fallen short. And that's the offering that I have, and how does that inform the American Constitution? And I think that someone like you would be someone who I would approach and say, hey, can you help me use this film as a tool, bring it to the right people and get it to the next step? So you may not be necessarily the audience who's eyes are being opened by this, but I think that there are a lot of people who, for discourse is actually the place that we're at, and we need to have it, and we need to go deeper and more nuanced and more complex.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing the work. And to all of you for participating.
And thank you, Rose and Satin, my editors. I did not do this by myself at all. Thank you, guys. So you can